Kelly, and this is Blake Bowles. I'm so excited, Blake, to be talking to you. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Kelly.
Yeah, it's good to see you, talk to you. I was just telling Blake before we started recording, but I've been a fan of his work and love the messaging and what you're doing for not just teens, but I feel like for all of us, we get this like inspiration to kind of be and think differently.
Thank you.
So if you haven't seen Blake's stuff, I'll put the link to your website. Is it blakebowles.com? Is that the best?
Blakebowles.com. Easy
Okay.
peasy.
So I'll send people there in the comments when I put this on YouTube. But let's start. The name of the show is Why I Learn. And I basically, to start out, went to my network and said, who do you know that learns? And Blake's name popped up right away. As you look at blakebowles.com, like you'll see why. But I would love to just start with like a learning moment for you, Blake, and a time where maybe like, I don't know if there was like a first time, but just like a moment that stands out to you as like making a choice to learn something.
Oh, I've got one of those for you.
Perfect.
No problem. As we were talking about just before hitting record, I went into college to study astronomy and physics, and that was pretty interesting, but really I realized later on it was socially validating to be able to tell people, to be able to tell my parents or peers that I'm studying astrophysics at Berkeley is just kind of like it's a signaling mechanism for saying like, look, I made it.
You're telling people you're smart.
Yeah, I'm saying, hi, I'm smart. I'm Blake. Nice to meet you. And I guess that feels good for a little while, but then once I started getting into the more advanced physics and math, I had this imposter syndrome, and I was thinking, man, this is not actually something I want to do. I don't think I actually want to be a research scientist. It's interesting, but it's not interesting enough for me to be one of the hard workers. I saw myself, sliding into the segment of the classes where I was just struggling to get by. And fine, that could have been okay. But at approximately the same time, I was recognizing that I really loved working at summer camps, and I loved working with teenagers. And so I thought maybe I could teach high school science. And so that idea was floating around in my brain. And here's the learning moment. Then a friend handed me a book by a former school teacher named John Taylor Gatto, who had done all this incredible work in the public schools in New York City and won all these awards like New York City Teacher of the Year 3 times in a row, New York State Teacher of the Year twice in a row. And then he quit kind of at the apex of his career, and he started writing and lecturing on why he thinks the school system is deeply flawed. And he said, and he wrote in an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal, I no longer want to make a living hurting kids anymore. So I picked up this guy's book because a friend handed it to me because the friend knew I was interested in education, broadly speaking, and I could not put it down. It was like the most intellectually captivating moment, but it wasn't just intellectually interesting. It was like this aha moment that this is a life path that's way more relevant and compelling and important than studying the physics of far off stars and galaxies and dark matter. However interesting that stuff may be, it wasn't interesting plus relevant. And so
okay, let's put in a little bit. So it's not, as we like analyze this moment, it's not status. It's not like it wasn't for you about communicating your worth to the world.
No, not in a way that's easily recognizable. I mean, I was familiar with the average pay of teachers, and I imagine that the average pay in alternative education is probably much lower, which is true, by the way. So it was not a move to go up in perceived hierarchy or status. It was a feeling that this is a place where I could contribute.
Did you get good grades before? Like, were you one of these students that
Yeah, I mean, I was a straight A student in
all the way through high school.
Yeah, and then I got A's and B's at Berkeley, so I was able to play the school game pretty well.
Yeah. The game, yeah. Did some of your identity, like your self-image, was kind of tied up in that?
Of course.
I had the same exact story happen, and people who have followed me have heard me talk about this. Where I was the salutatorian in my high school. I was proud of the fact that I never got above 91% on any class. So I got all A's, but it was always between 90 and 90. and then I would go literally like play sand volleyball or just like waste time, in video games and stuff. And I got to MIT, as a grad student, I remember being like, uh-oh, it was a scary moment because not only did I like totally fail my first test, and I really like did not know, it was like I didn't know the math, I didn't know the physics. I was so far behind. There were people that knew stuff. So imposter syndrome, like you're talking about, like totally crumbled. But then there's this like identity too that's built around it. And I later found out that like mental health and suicide are like a real big problem in places like this, where you have people who are by all measures like intelligent, you know, capable of doing good things in the world, but they believe so much. And maybe this is what Gatto was getting at, right? When he was saying there's actually harm in it. They believe so much that the message that you are your GPA or you are your transcript. And it's like, uh-oh, like I had this identity crisis. It was a weird moment for me.
Yeah, and it's allowing your identity to be defined and measured by this large impersonal system outside of you. And to a certain degree, as social creatures, we can't avoid that, right? We can't just fabricate our own identity and image out of, you know, cloth. But the school system is such a narrow slice of the human experience, and yet that's the only slice that most kids get exposed to, and so it's very easy to over-identify with it.
So you read Gatto and then you say, I want to be in education. Maybe you'd already kind of said that, but you're like, I want to do it in a totally different way. I want to help young people learn. And somehow you have to like reconstruct an identity, right? Is that kind of like, how long did this take and what did that look like for you?
It was pretty quick, actually. This was one of the most intense periods of a few months in my life. And this was 2003. And I essentially went onto Amazon.com and bought all of the books. You know, people who read John Taylor Gatto also read, and I just like click, 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 click. And so I started learning about homeschooling and unschooling and democratic free schools, and read some of the more radical critics of the 60s and 70s. And I discovered there's this whole ecosystem out there. And so within about 2 or 3 months, I realized, okay, if I'm going to be honest with myself, I have to dive into this. I have to study this full time. And that's how I ended up designing my own major to study alternative education.
So you design this major, you find an advisor, you create a thesis, you like a bunch of courses that come together, and then you start pursuing, and really like that's an inflection point that's continued, right? If you imagine the rest of your life since then.
I've stuck with it. I really have used my major.
Maybe that's an advice for people that are thinking about what to major in. It's just invent your own, and then you'll be more likely to use it.
Yeah, well, there's some colleges out there like Prescott where you're essentially forced to do that.
And so, that's awesome. Super interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about this learning moment, because as you're having this moment, it sounds like the things that you learned before that were for knowledge, like for maybe knowledge. You use words like interesting or fascinating, or there's like this hedonistic like pleasure that comes from knowing something. There's like, we talked about status and identity, like I am this, I can, project being a smart person. It's interesting as we drill into this moment and this transformation for you. It's not really about those things. The status of an alternative educator is lower by most accounts than the status of a astrophysicist. You could argue that like the level of sort of intellectual complexity, it's different. And these are big, hard problems. And I'm in the space too now. So I don't want to like undermine it, but it's definitely not, people use phrases like, it's not rocket science. Like it's not astrophysics. It's different types of problems.
Yeah.
And yet for you, it was more meaningful. It was like real learning. Can you talk a little more about, learning to do or learning to be, as opposed to like just learning to know?
Well, that's a big question. Let me respond slightly differently. I want to reemphasize two aspects that really captivated me. The first one was feeling like I could contribute to this field in a meaningful way. And the second one, it actually comes back to that idea that, okay, so being an astrophysicist is this sort of prestigious title, and you get to study and work on problems that most other people in the world are, you at least think are incapable of working on. So you're on top of some sort of intellectual hierarchy here. But what became much more compelling for me was the fact that talking about education is something that you can do with almost anyone in the world. You can do it with people who are intellectual or not intellectual. You can do it with people on any side of the political spectrum. Yeah. Everyone has had an experience with school, learning, education, and actually being a little bit critical of schools is something that is a great opener. It's a great conversation starter. I can talk with virtually anyone in the world, because most people in the world have had an imperfect experience in school. And so maybe they mostly loved it, but there were some hard parts. Maybe it was a tragic, horrible experience for them. And so this gave me a way So yeah, studying astrophysics, I'd be able to have a meeting of the minds with like this very tiny group of other highly technically trained scientists. But with education, I could talk with anyone. That is a compelling
Yeah,
feature right there.
You were like drawn by this connection to humanity. It's like I want to do something that matters to lots of people.
Yeah,
Be involved.
yeah. And when people talk about startups and startup culture, and you need this idea that will scale, like working in education is not very good. It's much more tricky in that sense because so much of education needs to be done face to face. Yeah, but the ideas can scale for sure because there's so much fertile territory for people to want to think and talk about these ideas. And anyone who's ever had a kid has to face the decision, what do I do with my kid, educationally speaking? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you just said because I had this weird moment. I was standing next to a poster. So I did grad school in nuclear fusion, and I built a laser polarimeter, this particular type of measurement device on a tokamak fusion plasma. So there's this laser system, and it bounces around. It was super interesting and hard, and I had to like learn all this stuff. And MIT gave me $1 million to spend on laser parts, so I got to basically take everything out of the box and like build this laser system. And I remember like a couple years into that, I'm standing at a conference for the American Physical Society, and I'm standing next to my poster, which explains my experimental results. And I counted 6 people came. It was 5 people because I was the 6th, and we were the 6 people that were building laser polarimeters for tokamak plasmas, right? Like, so one from Korea, one from Europe, one from UK, one from San Diego. So there's like a few experiments that like were like my experiment, and I had this terrifying moment of like, there are 6 people that care what I'm doing, like literally 6, and I know them, and I just talked to all of them in one day at this conference. And in contrast, like you're saying, problems that matter to the masses, right? Super interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that there's people working on nuclear fusion also, because if you ever crack that egg, it's going to be a big game changer for the world.
It's coming. Yeah, I still have some good friends working in that space, so I'm definitely cheering for them. It was just, for me, that was missing, right? And it's interesting to look at learning, because I think learning can be different. There were a lot of the motivation for some of my classmates was much more about like just the struggle of like solving the problems. Like they just wanted, give me as technically challenging of a problem and let my brain go at it. And so this is nothing to say like one version is better. I think the question is just, who are you and what, like finding that click point where you find something that really
aligns. Completely.
You've seen this with kids. I mean, can you talk a little bit about like helping a teenager find that moment? Or I wished, for example, that I had found that moment much sooner than age 26 as a grad student, right? So hear your experiences.
It's a hard thing to control, right? Even if you dedicate all your energy and resources to helping a kid find their thing, that's no guarantee that it's going to work. And it might even be an anti-guarantee that's going to work because there's so much pressure on them. And that's a whole other discussion we can have, this narrative about finding your passion and how useful that is or not. But as to what I do with teenagers who I've worked with, so a lot of these teens actually don't need that much help. They have been given a basic level of freedom and responsibility by their parents, and they are able to use the internet to investigate things that interest them. And for all of the perils of the YouTube algorithm or mindless scrolling through Instagram, there's a lot of stumble upon potential when you are highly talented at doing online research. And so they often stumble into things themselves. But I found that I've been useful to teenagers when they're trying to go to that next step, and they've realized that everything they've learned through online searches or books or movies, they've come to the end of that, and they need more in-depth kind of behind-the-scenes knowledge. And so if you're trying to decide between a couple different potential career paths, and that means maybe I'll go to college for this or this, so it's a pretty big decision, you need to talk to someone who knows what it's really like. And so I've spent a lot of time when I've done one-on-one coaching with teens, and also in some of my programs, explaining this is how you reach out to a stranger. This is how you ask for a coffee date, how you ask for a 30-minute informational interview over Skype. And it's something that is so technically not challenging. Like, all you have to do is write a 2-paragraph, well-worded essay that you have 2 people proofread before you send it, and then be able to have a give and take over email. Like almost anyone can do that. But it is a terrifying thing for a lot of teenagers to take that next step. And there's a lot of imposter syndrome happening there too. They think, who am I to ask this incredible person or this person who's employed in this field for information? And I said, you have every right to do this. And often that person will feel flattered and honored that you are reaching out to them and tickled too. It's like, here's a 15-year-old emailing me, asking me about my kind of weird career. Sure, I'll give this kid 20 minutes.
We did. Wait, it's funny you bring this up. So we had one of our projects in, so Prenda has all these like project-based learning as part of the model. And so I was watching these 10-year-olds grapple with this question, right? Of we're going to learn about, I think it was like rainforest scientists, like people who study rainforests. And it's cool because you can go on and read the CV and like look up people's papers and see what other people have done. And they always have like a public facing website that's accessible to a 10-year-old. So these kids were getting excited and kind of feeling connected to these people. And to have them then get to that next step of like, there's this like terror moment of like, I'm going to send this. I don't know if you've ever used the service MailChimp, but it's an email service. They've got this great graphic of like a gorilla like about to push a button.
I'm familiar with that. Yeah,
it's like the best GIF I've ever seen because it's like exactly the emotion of that moment. Like I'm about to send this email, and then they send it, and then the joy of getting that response and reading that.
Yes,
like, it's worth so many lecture hours of to be able to experience that and to ask questions and get answers back from another human. It's cool.
Yeah, that's empowerment right there.
It's awesome. Empowered learners. So talking about becoming an empowered learner, I mean, and I think you're seeing this in your story, and now we're talking about it in the stories of some of these children, but you have, I use the fire analogy a lot, which is really Plutarch's analogy, right? Like the mind is not a vessel to be filled, it's a fire to be kindled. And you're talking about like spark-like moments, which, for these teens, it's like, I found something online that seemed interesting. I read everything I could find about this. For you, it was, I'm encountering John Taylor Gatto and I'm like reading his ideas. Those are like sparks. And then there's like the sort of building the fire up. And I know you've spent a lot of time outdoors, so I'm sure you've experienced like starting fire from nothing. Do you see that? Maybe not, less of that. Yeah. My son's obsessed. I have a 12-year-old that's obsessed with flint and steel, and he like scorns me if I use matches or lighter fluid. It's like, this is the way fires are done, Dad. So, but like it really is like almost like this voodoo dance. Like you have to do all the stuff, and you have to make sure the oxygen's right and the kindling's all right and everything's there. Your stuff is dry enough. And anyway, watching him do this, it's like I think about learning in that sense of like creating the right conditions where that spark can turn into a flame and fan out. You talked about just now, like reaching out to other people in the field and learning from other humans as a huge step in that. Can you, as you think back on your own learning experiences or others that you've watched, like, can you think of other elements of kind of moving from spark to flame that, if you'll kind of permit me to kind of do that analogy?
Yeah, I permit you. Yeah, I think surrounding yourself with good people. It's very old, trite advice, but it's timeless.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I finished college, I went to go work in the field of outdoor education. And this was fine. I was highly prepared for this work. It's essentially doing summer camp year round. And so I would take groups of fifth graders from LA hiking many of them have never seen a deer before. And so there was a lot of learning that was happening automatically. I taught basic physical sciences. I led ropes courses. Like, it was fine, but I knew that was nowhere near the end point for me. But I didn't know where to go next. And so I think I felt like a teenager in that sense of I know some things, but I know that this is not the end. And the place that really catapulted me into the next phase of my life was this summer camp called Not Back to School Camp, which is run by Grace Llewellyn, who wrote the Teenage Liberation Handbook, one of my all-time favorite books. And I ended up going to work at Not Back to School Camp. And it's only for a week or 2 weeks in the back to school time period, August and September. It happens in Oregon and Vermont. And this was I read about a lot of self-directed learners, and this was the first time that I was surrounded by like 100 of them. So these are teenagers who came from all over the US and Canada, sometimes farther. And they were just deeply inspiring people. And the staff who I worked with also, some of whom were grown unschoolers and homeschoolers, also really inspiring people. And that is what kind of led me to want to work with teenagers who choose not to go to school as more of my full-time career, instead of just doing outdoor education, which is nice because it's kind of like summer camps, and summer camps are fun. And so that would have only happened if I thrust myself into this new community where I was a complete outsider. I knew not a single person going into the world of Not Back to School Camp, but it completely changed my life.
That's awesome. So I'm getting like, ask questions is almost a starting point, right? Like that's the first initial foray. But now we're saying more than that, like go join them, like live among the people that you want to learn from, and spend that time really immersing yourself in activity. Like that's, you know, you talk about learning a foreign language. The real advice for anybody over, you know, over 10 is like, just go live there, right?
Yeah, and the immersion aspect is crucial. I mean, that's the difference between Duolingo and immersion learning. And that's the difference between me just reading about unschooling and then going to live side by side with a group of 100 unschoolers for a week or 2 weeks. I think anytime there's a chance to go to be around these people who you want to learn from or you want to learn about 24 hours a day, like it's just like when you go to a conference. It could be an academic conference, it could be a conference about anything. There's the stuff that happens during the day, the courses and the talks, and then there's all the stuff that happens in between that and at night, and that is often where the magic happens.
Right.
You need to be around these people all the time.
Smart conferences are canceling the sessions now. It's just like a perpetual coffee break, which I think is really interesting. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, Blake. This is fascinating. Thank you for just drilling in a little bit on your experience with learning. And I will, again, put the link to your website in the comment here so people can at least see as they watch this and learn from you. I think there's so much more we could drill into, but I appreciate you being here.
Thanks a lot, Kelly. It was fun.